Welcome to the Cloud Connectors mini-topics, where we cover a specific tool or technique to help you build, test, and scale your HR integrations. For the next 12 minutes, we'll show you how to use the Cloud Connectors Smart Connectors to pull data from a supported API. In mini-topic 2, we talked about a talent acquisition use case where an agency matches candidates to jobs that their clients have posted. That agency would need to have that job's data available in order to match candidates and create applications on their behalf. Today, we're going to illustrate how that integration might work, showing how our smart connectors allow you to access data. We're specifically doing this against Greenhouse for this example. However, this would work for any system whose API supports similar actions. Here I'm starting with a nearly empty workflow, with only ins and outs, so I'll need to install the Greenhouse package so that I can set up the Harvest Smart Connector. To do that, I just need to go to the left-hand panel, select Packages, and search for and install Greenhouse. Next, I want to install the Smart Connector for the Greenhouse Harvest API, so I switch over to the Nodes tab and again search for Greenhouse. And here I see the Query Harvest node, which I can drag and drop into my editor canvas. Once it's in place, I can dismiss the left-hand panel and wire the standard in node to the Query Harvest node's input port. Double-clicking on the Smart Connector node itself brings up its configuration panel on the right. As always, there's a summary description of the node at the top, with links to our internal documentation and the external systems documentation. Looking at our internal documentation, we can see that, in addition to a high-level description, each of the supported operations is listed. At the Cloud Connectors, when we are looking at a large API, we will typically add operations only as needed, and we're happy to add them as necessary. So if you ever come across an operation you know is available but is not in the list, please let us know via a support ticket, and we'll get it added for you, typically within a few business days. If you need to get started immediately with a prototype and can't wait for those few days, we also have an invoke option which will allow you to configure the URL for any operation in the associated API, allowing you to leverage the Smart Connector's ability to handle authentication and pagination, even for operations which are not fully supported. For this video, we're interested in the list jobs operation. If I click that entry in the documentation, it will show the options that are supported in the API for the query, as well as the schema of the data that will be returned. While it's often convenient to review this information in the documentation, it's also equally easy to look at it in the Smart Connector itself. Let's go ahead and do that. Going back to the Workflow Editor console and looking at the configuration panel, the first item to configure is the description, and it's always a good idea to give your nodes meaningful descriptions. I'll change this default to Get All Active Jobs. The next one down the list is the connection. We'll come back to that in a bit because doing so will require that we get an API key from Greenhouse. Moving down the list, the next item is the option to use a custom data schema, which is only necessary if you've got custom fields you need to be able to access. We'll cover the use of this feature in a different video. Next is the option to use a query that's in a separate configuration file instead of embedded in the configuration panel. This is useful if you're building an integration which will be reused for multiple different organizations that use Greenhouse, and where the query might need to be customized for each organization. However, if you're building this integration as a one-off, or if the query won't be customized for every instance where it's installed, embedding the query in the panel is just fine, so that's what we will do here. The Simple Convert option applies when you don't require any complex transformations, just field-to-field mappings, and you know the destination schema because you've got the load step configured in the integration as well. Since we're just doing the extract here, we'll leave that unchecked. That brings us to the actual query, and to set that up, we just have to choose an operation. Here, I'll choose List Jobs, and you can see that our query validator is already indicating that our query isn't complete because we haven't specified our inputs, nor have we chosen any output fields. Clicking on the input option, we can see that all of the options available in the API will show up here, and I'm going to choose the simplest option, which will be to request all requisitions which are currently active. I click Active, the Boolean option shows up, and I can select True from the dropdown. If I wanted to do something more dynamic, I could, for example, look for requisitions which were updated after a specific date, and either set that to a static value or change the type to a payload reference, which would allow me to use a last run date to ensure I'm only getting the jobs that changed since the last time the integration ran. However, I'll go ahead and uncheck this, just because I'm trying to keep the example simple. Finally, let's figure out what data we need. Different use cases require different elements, but in most cases you'll want at least an identifier, a title, and description. In Greenhouse, it looks like there are a couple of identifiers, the entity ID and the requisition ID, so we'll grab them both. In Greenhouse, the field for the requisition title is name, and the description is in the notes field. This is different from system to system, and that is why we typically include links to system API documentation at the top of the connector configuration in case you need to validate. Sometimes it's nice to see a summary of your query configuration, and there are a couple of ways to do that. First, if you want to see that summary in the current view, you can scroll up and toggle the Hide Unselected Fields option, and that will ensure that only the fields you've selected are visible. In this case, our query is pretty simple, so it doesn't make a huge difference, but it's a nice feature in more complex scenarios. Another option is to look at the underlying cloud data query by clicking on View Query. If you're very familiar with the API and schema in question, you can even do edits here or in the advanced mode, but the point-and-click UI is the better option 99% of the time. Below the query is the option to filter the response data. I'll leave that empty for now. Finally, we need to store the output somewhere. I'll leave that at the default payload attribute of Greenhouse. With all that done, I'll save my changes and we're ready to go ahead and configure access to Greenhouse. Here we can see I'm logged into my Greenhouse sandbox, and I want to set up integration access. Please note, I'm going to be doing a very simple setup, and it may be that your configuration will require alternate options to ensure that you're granting access to exactly what the integration needs and only what the integration needs. To do this, I'll click on the gear icon to get into the configuration menu, and from there I'll choose the Dev Center, and from there API credentials. You can see I've got a handful of API keys, and for the integration you're building, it might make sense to review existing keys with your team to see if there's one that can be reused for the new workflow you're creating. Of course, when considering the reuse of existing API keys, please make sure to review the security best practices of all teams associated with that key and the integration to ensure that granular access restrictions are not being violated. Here, I'll go ahead and create a new key by clicking on Create New API Key. In the Create Key dialog, I have to select the API type. In this case, it's for Harvest. Next, choose the partner, and I'll select Custom. Finally, let's give it a description. Talent Acquisition Workflow Access. Right now, we'll just be pulling jobs, but in other videos, we'll be extending this integration to cover all interactions in the talent acquisition use case. Click on Manage Permissions, and your key will be generated for you to copy. Make sure to save it somewhere safe and secure. If you lose it, you'll need to generate a new key. Once you've done that, click the I have stored the API key button to bring up permissions. I know I'm going to need more permissions down the line, but I know that for now I've just got a list jobs operation in my workflow. So, in order to keep my security team happy, I'll expand the jobs permission and select only Get List Jobs, and then scroll down and save. When I need to, I'll come back and edit this key's permissions in order to add whatever access I require. Going back into our Workflow Editor console, let's take a look at the connection menu at the top of the Greenhouse Harvest Connectors config panel. Since we haven't configured any other Greenhouse workflows in this environment, there are no pre-built connection configs we can take advantage of, so we'll create a new one by clicking Create New Context Definition and Context Value. When we revisit this in a future video, if you don't want to create a new API key, you'll be able to reuse this one in other workflows, as long as you are able to update the permissions on that key appropriately. Clicking the Create option gives us our first dialog, which puts a placeholder in the workflow's context. Let's just name this Greenhouse. In the description, we'll put Harvest API, and in the help text, we'll indicate that it's for a jobs extract. Click Save, and that will bring up the option to edit the secret that'll go into the placeholder in the workflow context. We'll name it TCC Sandbox to reflect the environment we've granted access to, and I'll paste in the name of the API key we used for the help text so that we know where to find it if we need to update permissions down the line. Next, we paste in our newly generated API key, and we're almost good to go. The On Behalf of User ID is required for certain operations, such as creating a new candidate application. However, it isn't required for this operation, so we'll leave it empty. If the environment you're connecting to has a policy of expiring API keys, you can set a date on the credential here, and that will enable the credentials expiration notification option that can be configured to let you or your team know 60 days and 30 days in advance of expiry, as well as the day of. Last but not least is the debug mode, which is really just there for troubleshooting. We'll leave that empty. Click Save, and you'll see that there's a connection configuration for Greenhouse, specifically for the TCC sandbox, all ready to go. To test it out, I'll go ahead and put a halt on the extract node, and then I'll run the integration. The green light says that it was a success, so I'll click the tab with the gears on it at the bottom of the screen to open the debug menu. And we can see in the Node Output tab that there's a payload attribute called Greenhouse. And if we expand that, we can see that there are two structures within that attribute. Opening up the warnings first and expanding it fully, we can see that there are no warnings, but if there had been an error, we would have seen it here so that appropriate actions, such as notifications, could have taken place. But since there were no warnings, we can go back up to the list job structure, which is an array containing all of my job listings, and if I open up one, we can see the description, requisition ID, entity ID, and title of one of the available requisitions, ready to be fed with all our other data, down to the talent acquisition vendor's servers, so they can find the perfect candidate for all of our jobs and get them started in the hiring process. Thank you for watching the Cloud Connectors mini topic on using smart connectors to connect to APIs, focusing on Greenhouse. We will leverage what we've done in future mini topics as well, and you'll find that configuring other smart connectors is very similar, so you are welcome to check out other smart connectors that your team or your clients may be working with. Please check out all the mini topics in the Cloud Connectors channel.